Welcome to Unmasked, where we take off the filters and get real about faith, failure, and finding freedom. I'm your host, Wesley Farnsworth, a dad, veteran, author, and a man who's learned that God does his best work in the middle of our mess. Each episode will have honest conversations with people who've walked through addiction, pain, or doubt, and with pastors, leaders, and everyday believers who are learning to live and lead authentically. So take a breath, pull up a chair, and let's get real. This is Unmasked. Today on Unmasked, I'm honored to sit down with someone whose life defies every limitation spoken over him. Dorsey was born in 1977 with Apert Syndrome, a condition involving craniofacial differences and fused fingers and toes. Doctors didn't expect much, but his parents held an unwavering faith that God would write a different story. Growing up, Dorsey endured constant bullying, cruel names, and challenges after challenges, along with numerous surgeries. Schools told him he'd never finish college, but he refused to believe the word can't. Through determination, hard work, and what he calls a divine intervention, he earned an associate's degree, transferred to the University of Village Forge, and ultimately graduated with a bachelor's in youth ministry. Today, Dorsey lives with the belief that with God's help, all things are possible, and his life is a testament to that truth. His story is one of faith, perseverance, and overcoming the odds, an underdog story that inspires everyone who hears it. Dorsey, welcome to Unmasked. Thank you for being
Wesley,
with us today.
thank you so much for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, absolutely, man. When I first found you online and I read a little bit about your story, I was like, man, this is somebody that I've got to have on. So I was so happy when you agreed to be on with us today.
Well, as you said, I was born. I'm originally from New York. I'm currently living in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and as you said, I was born with a birth defect called Apert Syndrome on January 16th, 1977, which, as you said, is a birth defect of the hands and the face. And when I was born, my forehead was pushed outward, my eyes and nose were pushed, slightly back into my head, and my fingers and toes were fused together. I mean, I had no individual movement of them. And it's a genetic defect. And my parents were older at the time, and even back then, they didn't have the testing and the technology like they do today to determine the health of the baby and how long the baby, how healthy the baby is and how strong the baby is, different things of that nature. So, when they were, didn't know about the fact that I was going to be born with a birth defect. My parents didn't even know in the beginning that my mom was pregnant. She thought, because she was 41 at the time and my dad was 45, she had thought that, she had some type of tumor or cancer or something growing inside of her. So when she went to the doctor to, get a checkup, the doctor was like, well, you're healthy, everything's fine, but you do have a baby growing inside of you. And when I was born, the doctors looked me off to examine me, to, look me over and to, see what was going on. And, normally when babies are born, they usually hand off the baby to the mother and then the father to hold and to correct and whatnot. But that wasn't the case with me. And so my parents were probably aware that something was wrong, but not to the extent that doctors were going to tell them. And they had wheeled me back into the room. And my mom, told me the story that she had shown me hold up my hand and that my hand was, fused together. I had no individual movement, finger movement of them. And she thought that was the only thing that was wrong with me. And then doctors later came back in and said, look, he also has he doesn't have a sore spot or, opening in the skull to allow the brain to grow and allow the brain to function normally. And therefore, we think he'll become brain dead. We don't think he'll survive. And we think that the best option for you would be to put him into a institution and to let him be. And thankfully, my parents were both, believers in God and believers in Jesus and, said, this is a child that God has given us, and that we want to take care of, and we want to see how long he'll survive for. We're not going to sign the papers over. We're not going to put him up for a adoption or put him into an institution. And they decided that they would take me home. Doctors at Mary Immaculate Hospital were born in New York. One of the nurses there saw my story or heard about my story somehow and said, well, why don't you take him to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, where doctors are doing operations on babies like your son, and, you can see what they can tell you. And they did. And the doctors there said, well, we can operate and we can open the skull and to relieve the pressure on his brain. But, there's really no timeline of when we think he'll live for or how long we think he'll live for. One of the other, I heard from my parents was that doctors told them I wouldn't live past the age of 18. And in about 2 months, I'll be 49. So at 6 weeks of age, I had my first of many operations to relieve the pressure on the brain. And so I survived that, went through many operations up to about the age of 16, went through about 68 operations throughout my whole lifetime. And, many hours on the operating table, 10, 15 hours at a time for the, most serious operations. As I, started to grow and get older, my parents found out that they had a school out on the island called at the time it was called Human Resources School, now it's called the Henry C. Carter School for people with disabilities. So I started to, attend that school, and I never went to public school. My parents never, saw me, or wanted me to go to public school. They always wanted me to go to the school for people with disabilities. And I don't think, I would have made it very, done very well in public school anyway. So I'm glad that I stuck with what I was doing at the, private school anyway. And then, but as you said, I was teased, made fun of, called monster and freak at times in my life, both in the school I was attending and on the outside world as well. But as I started to get older, I started to, read my Bible and learn more about God and learn more about who God was and who God is in my life. I started to realize that, even though I have a birth defect, even though I have, difficulty speaking at times and, may look different and, different things of that nature, I started to realize that I was created in his image, that I was his masterpiece. Psalms 139 talks about how he created all of us in our mother's womb. Besides it being a birth defect, I don't know why God created me this way. I'll have to ask him one day when I see him face to face, but I do know that he has a plan and a purpose for my life.
Yeah, I have no doubt about that at all. I mean, just hearing your story so far has just been, it's something that I think many of us take for granted. We walk and, if you weren't born with a birth defect, it's not even something that crosses your mind. The struggles, that you've had to endure and go through, with school, and just what kind of challenges do you think you ran into in school that maybe our listeners wouldn't have thought about otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, well, some of them were, learning. I have a learning disability. I wasn't able to learn or to grasp as much as everyone else can or could have. Maybe now as an adult I can, because my mind and my brain has caught up a little bit. But I didn't do well on tests. I didn't do well in math and certain subjects. So it was difficult in that aspect, and especially when I was younger. I had to have a homeschool teacher come to my house while I was out of school to help me to keep up with what I was learning and what I was, or what the teachers were teaching in the classroom because I was missing out on so much of the schooling at the time. So it was nice that they had that option as well. Well, I would have been, maybe even a little further even behind than I was at the time. And, so as I got older, I started to think, as we all do, we start to think about, what is it that we want to do as an adult? What is it that we want to do, for life, for, God, for, whatnot. And there was a couple of things I thought about. I thought about maybe doing nursing or going back and doing, helping, doing something with computers and technology and things of that nature. And throughout my teenage years, I was always part of a youth group at my home church in New York, and they were always, the youth in that youth group, I give them credit because they always supported me and always surrounded me and always loved me. They never once, they blanked me, once in a while, but that was just being, fun stuff. But they never, teased me. They never make fun of me. They never called me names, never bullied me. None of that stuff. So one of the things that I thought about was becoming a youth pastor, and one of the youth leaders at the time who was there, he pulled me to the side one time. I was probably 18, 19 at the time. And he said, Dorsey, I see you, traveling the country sharing your story, and, you get those encouragement sometimes and you're like, okay, that's nice. Thank you very much. I appreciate that compliment. That's just not what I saw for myself at the time. And, even, and so I started to get ready to graduate high school. I had to have a meeting to determine, what I would do. Where would I go on to college? Would I be able to do, get a job and things of that nature? And the high school history teacher who was there, along with my mom, the people had asked him, do you think that Dorsey will be able to make it in college? And he said, no, I don't think that Dorsey will be able to make it in college. I don't think he has the ability to make it in college. And my mom and my dad both, they were big, supportive of me, and, they always encouraged me to do and figure out for myself what I could and could not do. And a lot of it was not, wasn't very much in my life, a lot in my life that I wasn't able to do. I do have limitations in my hand with raising my hand above my head and reaching on high shelves and different things of that nature. But, whenever I had a limitation, I always tried to figure out, what is it that I can do to help me not to have that limitation? And I wanted to go on to college, and they asked me, they said, do you want to go on to college? Do you think you can make it? I said, yeah, I think I can make it. I think, this is what God wants me to do. I think I can make it. And then they asked my mom, and she said, if he thinks he can make it, he will. And a few weeks later, before I went on to community college, my first stint in college, I had asked my mom, how long do you think it will take me to finish college? And she said, I don't care if it takes you 10 years as long as you finish. And so she wasn't that far off with that timeline, because it took me 4 years in a 2-year community college to get my first associate's degree, and then it took me an additional 5 years in a 4-year Bible college to get my bachelor's degree, along with another associate's degree. But I finally got my bachelor's degree in youth ministry in 2005. But while I was at Bible college and I went home for the funeral, unfortunately my mom passed away in 2002 due to complications from a stroke that she had suffered. So she did see me graduate, community college, but unfortunately she never got to see me graduate Bible college.
Man, I have zero doubt hearing this story that she knows you graduated and she's so proud of you. Man, that we could stop that story right here, and people would just be left with so much awe of what you've been through and where you've come. I just like the way you've overcome and the work that you've refused. I just like the way you've overcome and how you've refused to accept the word can't. It's just so awesome. I have so many questions swirling around in my head. I don't even know where to start. I guess, just start talking us through your faith through all of this. You know, obviously you've been through a lot, and for most people, it would be very easy to get angry with God and just be like, why am I like this? You know, and just turn away from him completely because he's made you like this. So just kind of talk us through your mindset as you've been, you know, as you were growing up, and some of the battles you had, and maybe some struggles with your own faith that you had.
Oh yeah, there were definitely times, in my life when, we talk about the angel on one side and then the demon on the other shoulder, and I definitely had that in my mind going on at times. And there were times when, I thought about the fact of, thankfully I never had anything in my hand. I never took anything, swallowed anything, none of that stuff. But I thought about the fact of ending my life. Would it be worth it to end my life? And, it was definitely my faith that played a big part of not doing it, because I remember, just hearing, not God's audible voice, but just hearing his spirit and reading his word, and his, reminding me that, hey, I have something greater in store for your life. Don't give up. People may see you this way, but I see you as my masterpiece, as someone that I created in my own image. And that's how I, got over it. I talked to my parents, I talked to, probably friends of mine, maybe, past about it, and, we just walked through it, and, just encouragement of knowing that, he has me right where he wanted me to be, and to keep fighting and to keep going and keep, to keep pushing forward. Even when I was younger, with all the operations and all the surgeries, my mom and I would, play together before the operations, and, I would be so nervous and so upset at times to even have to come into the operating room with me. And even, I remember one time she was holding the mask over my face to, put me to sleep, because the doctor was doing other things. And, we were singing the old hymn, because he lives. And the chorus in that song says, because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds the future. Life is worth the living just because he lives. And that's one thing I needed to remind myself. Life is worth the living because he lives, because Christ lives, because Christ is in heaven, waiting for us. We need to keep living. We need to keep moving forward with our life. We can't end our own life.
In your, in your introduction, I mentioned that you have this belief that with God, all things are possible. And you have obviously shown us that with your story about your education and work and school and everything that you have gone through. So bring us to the present. Talk about the things that you're going through now. What's life like for Dorsey in the present?
Well, my dad, who was 94 years old, passed away 11 passed away on November 4th in 2025. So he passed away, 13 days ago. And, I'm sure there are some people out there, wondering, except for Bible college, Dorsey never lived on his own. Dorsey never, without a parent, taking care of him or helping him or supplying for his needs and whatnot. How's Dorsey going to take care of himself? But, we know that, my God will supply all my needs. My God will take care of me when I need him. I need him all the time, but God will take care of me. Well, I'm not worried about living on my own, because I know that God has me and that God has me right where He wants me to be.
Yeah. I love that. I think back as you were sitting here talking and sharing your story, that comment you mentioned when you were talking about being in youth group and the youth pastor saying, Dorsey, I can see you traveling the country and sharing your story. I just love that. But I can tell you right now that while you may not be traveling the country, you are traveling the world just by doing podcasts like this and sharing your story with everybody. You're absolutely doing that. And I know you've done that before, and I think you're going to continue doing that. And I just love how this has come full circle, and you're now sharing your story again with a larger audience.
Wesley, it's funny. It's not funny, but it's interesting you bring it up because we haven't discussed that yet, and I never did become a youth pastor. It's just doors never opened up for me to walk into that. I went on interviews. I went on, like I said, I went on interviews, spoke with pastors, and every time I went on interview, they would say no, we're not interested, whatnot. And I started to get frustrated. I started wondering, God, you told me to go to Bible college. You told me to, you called me into the ministry. What am I missing? What am I not getting right now? So after Bible college, I came home and I went, started attending another church where I knew people, and the pastor there started to have a outreach event called Summerfest, and they, were asking people to, share their story about their life. So I went up to the pastor, hey, you want me to share my story? I'll be willing to do it. And I did. And during that time, I just felt another prompting of the Holy Spirit in my heart say to me, send this video out, send a letter out to churches, or call churches, and see what I will do with it. And that was in September, that was in June of 2007 that I started. And from June of 2007 till, a couple of years ago, because of COVID and everything shut down. But all that time, for about 15 years, I was traveling around in my story all across the country.
Man, I love that. So awesome. One of the things that I think people struggle with, and I'll be honest, there's times where I struggle with that too. I've been there, as of today, and this is recording, I've been unemployed for just over 8 months, and God is telling me, just trust me. And I'm sitting here now, I'm like, okay, God, like, what are you doing? What am I missing? I've applied to all these jobs and just keep getting rejection emails, even applying for local places like McDonald's and still getting rejected. And so I'm like, okay, God, you're obviously doing something here. So what am I missing? But it takes faith and it takes trust. And we don't always see what he's doing in the moment. And when he's done, then we go, so that's what you were doing. And so I can just kind of see that playing out in your life here where, God is like, just trust me. I had you go to school for a reason, had you go to Bible school, get your degree for a reason. And, you mentioned you had to stop traveling and due to COVID and speaking. And so now here we are just a couple of years past COVID, quote unquote. And things are starting to change. The world is opening back up, or the world has opened back up. And so tell us a little bit about what life is like for you now. What does God have you doing now with everything opening back up? And so, yeah, fill us in. Love.
Yeah, well, right now, currently I'm employed at a local retail store called Target, and I do guest services there. And uh, and then I'm right now I'm currently helping out with my local church with the youth group, helping out there with them. And we'll see what happens now. Now that my dad passed on, and I don't have to stay home and take care of him so much. Maybe I'll start traveling again. Who knows?
Yeah, wow. So one of the questions I also like to ask my guests on occasion is, What is your favorite Bible verse or verses? So, what you got for us?
There's a few of them, but I would probably say the one, thing one is probably Philippians 4:6. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition, present your request to God, and the peace of God which surpasses all understanding will give your minds and hearts to Christ Jesus. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, but to give you hope and a future.
Wow, that's a good one. That speaks a lot to the waiting season that you've been put in, or that he's put you in as you wait to see what your next chapter is. So I know that there's another chapter of your story coming down the pipe, man, and I can't wait to see what it is for you. Yeah. So, well, Dorsey, what would be your biggest piece of advice to the listeners that maybe there's somebody saying, Dorsey, I don't know what's going on in my life right now, and I am just so confused. What would you tell that person?
I would say don't give up. Don't give up on doing what it is that you want to do in your life, that you think that God has for you in your life. Sometimes we try to see, 5 miles or 10 miles down the road, but yet God wants to see, God wants to show us what's right in front of us. We try to see down the road and we're like, we can't see anything, but yet it's right in front of us that God has, is showing us step by step what it is that God has for us. And then eventually when we're down the road, we'll look back and then we'll see, okay, I see where God, brought me from.
Yeah, earlier you talked about your youth group and how the kids accepted you and treated you like one of them and poked fun at you, but not in a mean way, but in an including way. So how accepted or how important would you say being accepted was to you and your faith and really impacting who you are today?
Yeah, I mean, there's a possibility, that if I walked into that youth group and, you know, they didn't treat me, like you're saying, normal, that, I could have walked out and, maybe even walked away from God and said, God, even your people are not treating me, you know, the way that you're taught, the way you're telling them to treat other people. You're not treating me the way that you're, to love on me, to care for me, to, encourage me, to support me, but yet doing exactly the opposite of what the world does. Why would I want to be? Why would I want to, go to that church or go to any church if that's how, the people of God are going to treat me? But thankfully, they didn't do that. They did love on me. They did support me, both the youth and the adults in that church treated me with love and grace and mercy.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that it just is one of those things that I think um, should remind us all that, when we see people out and about that may look different than you, don't just write them off. Don't judge a book by its cover. You don't know the background. You don't know the story. I would probably be happy about that and be like, yes. So the chances of us doing that are probably pretty slim. And I get that. But, that's always out there.
Amen. Thank you, Wesley, for having me.
Dorsey, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your story with the listeners. I'm honored to have you on Unmasked and to hear your story. And I just pray that this is a reminder to all of us to remember that our story isn't over. Our story is just beginning. He's writing the new chapter, and that with God, all things are possible. So thank you for being with us. Well, thank you for joining me today on Unmasked. If this episode encouraged you, would you take a moment to follow, rate, and share it with somebody who you think could benefit from hearing it? For more encouragement and information on me and having me speak at your church or events or my coaching services, visit wesleyfarnsworth.com. And don't forget to connect with me on social media. Until next time, remember that grace is greater than your past, and freedom begins when we live unmasked. God bless you.